In the last class, I was trying to argue that Lila Abu Lugod's article, Writing Against Culture, and her work in general would help us transition into what I'm calling Anthropology 3.0, which is an anthropology that recognizes some of the issues that the depiction of culture brought up, that was able to think about history, interconnections, inequalities, power, and is also sensitive to who is talking about whom and intersectionality. I should have put in there, because it would help us as we started this section, that this is an anthropology that also recognizes the colonial legacy or the colonialist legacy of anthropology. And our editors in the introduction to this section on page 148 write that once the dust settled, anti-colonialist anthropologists and other critical thinkers struggled with how to move forward from the depoliticized texts that comprise a lot of postmodernist work. Think of Gertz's colonialist characterization of Balinese men as obsessed with their small brown cocks instead of as actors in anti-colonial struggles. There it is again, that double entendre. What are they bring it out for us again. Now, of course, they were talking about roosters, but this was the problem here, is that it was difficult to unite anthropology, what I called Anthropology 2A, the history and political economy set, with Anthropology 2B, which was the Gertzian literary set. But I was hoping with Abu Lugo that we were going to unite them, and that's what the authors in this section come in for. Or well, we have 5 authors here, and in my take on this, these authors are trying to grapple with this colonialist legacy. Now, I want to start with this term colonialist legacy. When you hear the term colonialist legacy, what does that mean to you? What images does it pull up in your mind? I'm glad you said that, because that is a key lesson that I've been trying to include in all of anthropology, is you can't just look at people as having these separate individual cultures. They were part of this legacy of colonialism. But when I say colonialist legacy, do you think good or do you think bad? Bad. Okay. I was curious about this because when I type into PowerPoint colonialist legacy, I get some very pretty pictures like this. It looks nice. Looks pretty. There you go. So I was just wondering, in anthropology, colonialist legacy, we've at least been taught that it has a bad legacy. In PowerPoint, it looks pretty nice. However, that goes pretty well with our introduction from the words of Balfour. Balfour, what would he say about the colonial legacy? It was probably was sort of a representative of his time, right? I mean, this idea that, or as he put it, that people in Egypt were incapable of self-governance. They couldn't govern themselves, and so they had to do it. It was their duty as Englishmen, and that we are there for their sake. We're in there, we're helping them out, we're doing them a favor, and they know it. So what was Said trying to tell us about this? What was his point about Orientalism? What does that mean? Look, probably more famous than he wasn't an anthropologist, more like a literary person, probably more famous than anything that got written. It's the idea that, especially in British and imperialism, it's hard for me to imagine Abu Lugod's work, for example, without understanding this influence. The idea of, why do Muslim women need saving, is also influenced by this idea of inferiority, superiority, exoticism, the lens of the other, and that the production of knowledge about other people, or the idea that you have knowledge about them, is a key part of this power dynamic. In fact, he writes something that, as Said writes something that is intense. He says on page 157, to say simply that Orientalism was a rationalization of colonial rule is to ignore the extent to which colonial rule was justified in advance by Orientalism rather than after the fact. So that this idea justified in advance the whole colonial enterprise. This is a pretty famous book, and I want to go into the Beatrice Medicine article now. Another person who was thinking about these issues, and one of the first people she talks about is another famous book that was written in 1969 by Deloria Jr. titled Custer Died for Your Sins. And he was talking about the native experience. Wrote perhaps one of the most famous lines about anthropologists. Into each life, some rain must fall. Some people have bad horoscopes, others take tips on the stock market. But Indians have been cursed above all other people in history. Indians have anthropologists. And then he would go on to talk about how every summer the anthropologists show up with their notebooks and their cameras and they record things and they take them away. So, given that idea, what does she say about this? What does she say about this thing that the indigenous people are cursed above all others because they're visited by anthropologists?
Oh, she likes to keep them.
Well, she does like to keep the anthropologists humble for sure. Yeah, she wants the outsider anthropologist to be humble. But what I don't know if you caught this. What's her response to Deloria? Since you didn't read Custer Died for Your Sins, which you would have if you had lived at that time, she says that you should look at it more closely. She says native readers seemingly do not go beyond page 100, where later he states, this book has been the hardest on those people in whom I place the greatest amount of hope for the future: Congress, the anthropologists, and the churches. So what he's saying there is, I'm criticizing you because I put a lot of hope here. She also is saying, hey, I'm an anthropologist and a native, so that's important. Of course, she is indigenous or native. Does that give her a special vantage point? She definitely thinks it's very important to have this perspective. Does it limit her in any way? Actually says it does. She says there were areas of investigation that were closed to me because until she had a kid, she was like seen as this little girl and she couldn't have access to the women and their ideas. So, I mean, she's pretty interesting about what she wants to do with this. Our editors say that this is an example of applied anthropology, where she's going in and really trying to work with her own people and to respond to the needs of the community, not to abstract outsider research question. The other thing that was striking to me about this is how much she was how many times she mentions Standing Rock Reservation. I mean, Beatrice Medicine says on page 153, issues based on Indians' tribal sovereignty, water, and treaty rights will make the future interface of anthropologists and natives a vital concern for those of us committed to a changing profession. So again, this is still a live issue. It still is very much in the fore, and I think that the fact that this was intertwined with anthropology was important for those people going from all over the world to be at Standing Rock and protest during that time. Now, medicine also says that we need less jargon in anthropological reporting. And at the end of the Anthropology 3.0, I said, well, I would like this to be what we need for the 21st century, but every so often, some of this anthropology is a little too academic-y, a little too jargony, maybe a little too insular. which brings us to Esteban Croce. Yeah, I guess anybody who's writing an anthropology of Mexican anthropology is gonna be tough. It looks like it's circulating a little too much. Seth, this was pretty hard. It was a tough read. It's not easy. So this article is called Anthropologists of the South. Their rise, their silencing, and their characteristics. My first thought here was on their silencing, because even though I think of myself as someone who works in a similar area of the world to Croce, not Mexico, but Latin America, I hadn't heard of his work. That was sad. That's a silencing. And then I Googled him, and every other person that I've Googled had their own Wikipedia page. But poor Esteban Croce, I can't find hardly anything about him. He's only got a LinkedIn profile. We know how crappy those are. Now, I found this great video, which is part 1 of 3, so it's about 40 minutes long. So I figure we can get through it. You all speak Spanish, right? It does have 43,000 views and quite a few comments, all in Spanish, that say it's good. So I'm sure it is. But no, I won't. We won't do that today. All right, we'll do a couple things. I think one of the stumbling blocks of this, I hadn't realized it before, but when I say, or Croce writes, Anthropologies of the South, what do you think he is writing about? The global South. What is the global South? Yeah, that's part of the issue. At least in our country, we might start thinking he's writing about Kentucky or something, but in fact, he is writing about what you, as Abby put it, the global South. And he makes at the end of this article, he makes a pretty big claim that we're dealing with the worldwide intercivilizational conflict that in our day divides the planet into two different and in a certain sense opposing spheres, the North and the South. I would like to hear, that's how he ends, or this section ends, but I would actually like to hear a little bit more about it from him on why this is, because it's a little bit different than, say, Edward Said's perspective. Okay, that said, I think there are some important points for, especially for those of us who visit and travel to and study in the global South. And one of his big points, I believe, is that simply that there are people in these areas who are themselves historians and anthropologists and academics. And a lot of people go there and they simply skip over them. They don't talk to those people. And it's important to recognize that people in their societies are trying to create these, are working in their own traditions. Now, he uses the word antecedents, which is a big word that we're just going to describe as people who have gone before. He calls them forerunners. So in the same way that we talk about Franz Boas, for example, and Margaret Mead, he says there's people in these areas who were also important in trying to analyze their own societies. He also notes that it's difficult to be an academic in the global South. He says that it's very difficult for people in the university there who would be professors in the North, you might say, that it's hard to be dedicated to full time to academic activities. So a lot of times if you are working in the global South as an academic, you have to get another job outside because it's not paying very well, or it's impossible to find that. And he says that anyone who has been able to visit universities in Europe and North America may wonder if the word university has the same meaning in the North and in the South. And so the whole distribution of resources and who is able to get an education can be very different. He also knows that as an anthropologist, it's different if you are citizens together in the same country. He also, again, uses a big word for this. He says different alterities, which basically means that that the others that you encounter as an anthropologist are going to be perhaps more intimately related to you, and that studying others is also going to have political implications for yourself. So he says that you can have general respect for indigenous peoples in a faraway country, but if you are involved in your own country, the legal recognition may affect the anthropologist's own social, political, or even economic interests. Which is to say that it's different to study somebody far away and be like, yes, indigenous rights. It's not so easy, perhaps, when it's much closer to home and may affect how you are living your life. I think it's important for in our own country as well. It's one thing to have this kind of abstract idea of, yes, we should support all people, but what does it actually mean to stand with the people of Standing Rock? Are we going to be prohibiting the construction of oil pipelines? And what will that mean for our own economic and political interests?